The incentive is to cut it all. The incentive is to cut any educational programming, cut libraries out, ensure that healthcare is provided at the least cost possible, provide no psychological counseling. And that is exactly what's happening.
Hello and welcome back to the Prison Cells podcast. I'm your host, Robert Craig, and alongside me again is John Dacey, the Executive Director of Abolish Private Prisons.
Thanks, Robbie. How are you today?
Doing great. Thanks for coming back. Also with us is Tank Johnson, founder of Native Creations and consultant to Abolish Private Prisons. How you doing, Tank?
Pretty good.
And today joining us, we have Dre Cummings. He is the Charles C. Baum Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. He's also the Associate Dean of Faculty Research and Development, and he's the co-founder and co-director of the Center for Racial Justice and Criminal Justice Reform. We're also very lucky to call him the board president of Abolish Private Prisons. Dre, how you doing today?
Excellent. Delighted to be here with you guys.
Great. Thanks for coming. So we are going to talk today about how the stock market affects private prisons, how private prisons interacts with the market, how market forces affect the inside of prisons and the people who are there, whether they are people who are incarcerated by private prisons, the people who work at private prisons, and broadly the effect that the market has and how the prisons affect the market. So, Dre, can you tell us a little bit about how you got here and what your expertise comes from?
Yeah. So as a young lawyer, I was involved in both sports and entertainment, as well as criminal justice reform efforts. And as I became a law professor, my background in the law was primarily in big firm work in connection with corporations, securities regulations, that type of thing at a law firm in Chicago. And so as a law professor, they asked me to teach a variety of classes: contract law, business law, but also sports and entertainment law and other subject matters. And as I was teaching business law as a young law professor, we focused in a certain segment of class on the role and purpose of corporations. And one of the primary goals of a corporation is to provide profit and profit maximization for their shareholders. And one day, as I was preparing to teach class, it's this famous case called Dodge versus Ford, where Henry Ford's being sued by the Dodge brothers, and the court in Michigan in 1918 says the reason that a corporation exists is for profit. I stumbled across an article when I was thinking about profit maximization in maybe early 2000s about this new sort of entity for profit centered called a private prison. And I started thinking back to my days of, being a young lawyer and working at this large firm and interacting with a bunch of young kids in Chicago that lived on the west and south sides, where I was sort of helping with some criminal justice reform work. And it just floored me that a corporation could exist whose primary profit was to lock people up, to make money off of imprisonment. And I was just shocked by it. Wow. And I thought about the Corrections Corporation of America and the GEO Group, and the fact that there were a group of owners, board members, shareholders, whose primary motivation was to make money off of people being locked up. And it sort of started inspiring in me all of these thoughts about the kinds of perverse incentives that existed in a for-profit corporation whose primary business was incarceration. I couldn't believe it existed.
It's almost like, how did they even get past like the creation phase, right? Like once you start thinking about humans and being in prisons and for profit, you should have had a full stop right there. But of course, they kept going and found a way to actually make this thing go.
Instead of a full stop, Tank, in 1970, a group of white men in Tennessee had this bright idea. Let's try to privatize and profitize incarceration. And so nobody at that point in time, as you suggested, stepped up to say, whoa, this is immoral. Stop this. And in fact, not only didn't they stop it, it has grown into a burgeoning industry under our very noses. Those of us that care about criminal justice reform are like, what is this? How can this exist? The fact that corporations exist to profit off of human beings being locked up.
It just speaks to the deviant nature of it. And like, people don't realize what's going on in our backyards. And, I believe that if, we just keep banging on the tables, like we're going to get people to kind of move off of their position because this should be infuriating to all involved.
Yeah, I think the way you mentioned it earlier about how a corporation exists to make money, right? And in the law, there's this concept of like making reasonable business decisions to make sure that you protect the directors who are making those choices. I think there's a growing sentiment among the public that businesses should be thinking about more than just profit, right? Like you start to see, especially like the Sunrise movement, you see young people start to say like corporations, you need to think about what is the planet going to look like in 50 years and 100 years. Have you seen in your work how like are corporations starting to think about morality more? Or are you still seeing this black and white, let's make profit first and then we can do those things later? How do businesses think about that?
So here comes the law professor part of me.
Uh-oh.
So this case, United States Supreme Court case called Citizens United in 2010, basically held that corporations are just like individuals. They have free speech rights, so that corporations can engage in politicking and using corporate treasury money to politic, right? And at the time when Citizens United was announced, that corporations have a right to get involved in campaigns and support, campaigning through corporate treasury money, there was a whole bunch of politicians that were pretty excited about that because corporations historically have been sort of viewed as, for lack of a better word, conservative, or supporting.
They were excited about a conflict of interest.
Yeah, right. So the whole thinking there in 2010 was that corporations are now going to be a big funder of conservative causes, right? And privatization of education and privatization of prisons, etc. But the really interesting thing is, in light of the George Floyd protests, the international protests a couple of summers ago, corporations started recognizing that maybe they had a role to play in eliminating systemic racism and institutional discrimination. And so many corporations in 2019 and 2020 have come out with these pledges. Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan, comes out and says, we're going to pledge $30 billion to ending systemic racism. And American Express and Wells Fargo and these others sort of jumped in saying, maybe we can be a part of the answer to these inequities that continue to exist. And suddenly all of these think tanks and conservative forces that were so supportive of corporate power and corporate First Amendment rights are now backlashing, saying corporations need to shut up and they need to stay in their lane and they need to stay out of politics, in a way that to me is super hypocritical, which is, if corporations are going to engage in criminal justice reform support, this sort of woke controversy now that we're talking about, I find these conservative forces that are sort of, once corporations step up and decide we have a role to play in eliminating systemic discrimination, then suddenly these conservative forces are up in arms that corporations should no longer have a role to play. And so my answer specifically, Robbie, Tank, to your questions are, corporations do have a role to play. Corporations, let's reframe that. Corporations have a role to play in criminal justice reform because corporations have been a root cause of the racism, discrimination, inequity that continues to exist in the United States today. And they should repair it. They should put shareholder funds, corporate treasury funds behind equalizing and repairing the inequities and the discrimination that exist in the system today?
I mean, well, I kind of call this the social justice wave right now, and I think the hard part is deciphering who is authentic, who really cares, and who's doing it to check a box. Because during the pandemic, you saw everybody kind of pick up that flag and march with it, and it, for a person who's kind of been on the ground, it was a little overwhelming to kind of have all these new contributors to the space. And to your point, we can use all the help we can get, but I'm just looking for the real authentic people in this.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much, Tank.
Tank, I wonder if you have some thoughts about this. As Dre was talking, you have this backlash against corporations who finally found their voice to stand up for some of these issues. And it struck me that sometimes athletes face this, right? Where if they say something that some group of the population doesn't like, they get told to shut up and dribble or shut up and throw the ball. And then you hear the same people that may have been saying some of those things say the opposite when the athlete says something that they agree with. In the people that you've talked to, have you heard any thoughts about how to address that? How does it make them feel when they get told, all you are is an athlete, all you are is a football player, and you shouldn't have political thoughts. You shouldn't use your influence that you have over people to make things better.
Yeah, I mean, one of the bigger kind of, wrongs in this world is kind of putting people in a box and just kind of saying that you're a one-track thing. And I one of the resources that I created at the NFL, My Cleats, My Cause, it shows that a number of players have social cause interests from an organic standpoint, and they have a voice and a platform, and they can help. And I think that the corporations and even the fans who give them backlash because they want to reach out and help, it doesn't help the overall cause. It doesn't move us toward where we need to be. And I'm seeing a lot of athletes nowadays a little bit more less shy to come out and show their support now because of the overwhelming support in the country.
At APP, we believe the only way to truly end for-profit prisons in the United States is to challenge the constitutionality of private for-profit prisons in the courts. And with your help and moral courage, we will succeed. Completely donor-funded, we ask for your support. Your tax-deductible contribution will provide vital funding for building the infrastructure necessary to win a fight of this scale. And every dollar will bring us one step closer to our goal of abolishing private prisons. Please join the fight today by visiting abolishprivateprisons.org and click the donate button at the top of the site. And of course, like, share, and subscribe to the Prison Cells podcast from wherever you listen. Now back to the discussion.
I wanted to jump in, Robbie, really quick here, because I think Tank said something about authenticity that's really important, which is if corporations are pledging, I think American Express was $1 billion and JP Morgan Chase was $30 billion. If they're really pledging these dollars, who's keeping track of whether they're actually implementing or injecting these dollars into these sort of causes to erase systemic racism? And one example I wanted to provide is that Walmart's CEO came out and said, Walmart has a role to play in ending systemic injustice. And Professor Anastasia Bowles and I created the Center for Racial Justice and Criminal Justice Reform. And so we went right to Walmart and said, are you ready to put your money where your mouth is? And Walmart has donated or contributed a grant to our center of $1 million to support a court observation program in Arkansas. And so to Tank's point about authenticity, we had some meetings with some Walmart executives who are really committed to being a part of the answer, ending systemic discrimination. I would have never imagined that. I would have never imagined that Walmart, an international global giant, had an interest in ending systemic discrimination and racism here in the United States. And I've been very happy to see that there are committed executives at Walmart that will write a check for $1 million for us to sit law students in courts throughout the state of Arkansas to ensure that everyone's being treated fairly and to allow an opportunity for us to ensure that the Constitution is being followed in the courts in Arkansas. And so, to Tank's point about authenticity, I think there's a role for us to play in putting corporations' feet to the fire and saying, step up. Let's see what you're doing. Let's see. And Walmart has stepped up, at least to the extent that they're interested in a court observation program in Arkansas. And I'm talking about other corporations about police reform grants, and they're having meaningful conversations in connection with this movement, the social justice, movement, the wave, that Tank's talking about. It's heartening to think that corporations are stepping up, although they're facing a significant backlash too. And I find that's always been true historically in civil rights. Whenever there's been progress made, the backlash has been immediate and intense. And right now, the backlash is against woke politics. It's against critical race theory. Most of the people that are coming out against critical race theory don't even know what it is. It's just another straw man opportunity for individuals to say you're corrupting sort of this American vision or dream, when really what we're talking about is getting to a point where we can realize the American dream for all individuals equally in this country. And that's how I view this wave.
Yeah, but another thing that I've experienced, and I'm sure that we've all experienced in this, is that you've got these large corporations that they set this money aside, but when people like us go to get the money, I mean, it's almost like getting a loan for my house. And it's like, do you really want to contribute this? Then why are you making it so hard? I understand checks and balances. I understand we're in a world where fraud is a part of our everyday life, but it still seems a little bit disingenuous sometimes, because I think people can almost become exhausted in the process and say, nah, I'm done with it, and thus never get to that point where they get the grant and be able to do the great things with it. So I'd like to see a little bit more of a streamlined process in terms of getting those funds.
Yeah, let me just say really quickly to that, Tank. I completely appreciate what you're saying. When you have bureaucracy tied into these pledges of these billions of dollars, it often gets caught up in the red tape, and it gets caught up in the fact that not everybody along the stream is committed to ending the systemic discrimination that Jamie Dimon talks about, or Doug McMillon, the CEO of Walmart. And so you have individuals in the middle that may not be as committed to their CEO statements, and it's very difficult to get your hands on these dollars.
Listen, John and I had to set aside an entire day, almost a day and a half, to just fill out one form to acquire $5,000, right? And like I said, understanding checks and balances, but it just seems like an awful lot.
Yeah, I wanted to slightly zero in on private prisons, though. There's a cynic in me and I don't know if this is just the fact that I'm naturally cynical, if it's me playing the role of a law student since I'm sitting here with a professor, but I wonder if we look. So I think a lot of people think that the reason that corporations are doing this is because they feel forced to by the consumer, right? There's a young, growing movement of people out there that are starting to make decisions based off their pocketbook.
Corporate guilt?
Right. Yeah. And they're told that the reason that, vote with your dollars, right? Vote with your wallet. There's people out there that are thinking, oh, I can actually institute change if I can stop spending money at certain places. This turns on a certain relationship between the business and the consumer, right? Like if I'm a consumer, I have to be able to buy or not buy from that company. Do you think that incentive changes when you're a private prison and your customer is not an individual, it's a government actor, right? So I wonder if you have any thoughts about the way that the sort of growing awareness of social justice issues among marketplace consumers may not have the same force when the consumer is the government instead of, groups of people.
That's a really insightful thought, Robbie. Two things jump to mind. One is a law professor friend of mine, Emma Coleman Jordan at Georgetown, terrific Howard Law graduate. When she heard me say I'm heartened by these corporate pledges, she scoffed and said, that is all PR. That is nothing about ending systemic racism. That is about corporations trying to get on this bandwagon and have consumers support this
I said the
idea
same thing, by the way.
that corporations are, yeah. So, and that goes to the cynic in, I guess, you, Tank, and you, Robbie. The question is, are they committing dollars? Right, because at the end of the day, it comes down to, and I can tell you that Walmart has committed dollars, even though, as you say, Tank, it was an extraordinarily heavy lift to get that commitment.
I mean, look, I've seen the look of white guilt and corporate guilt, right? I've seen it, right? Being at the NFL, like I've been on the corporate side of that, and I've seen that, it. Once they see the groundswell of a movement, then it's like, oh, okay, how do we jump in and make sure that we don't miss this moment in history to be on the right side of history? And it seems a little self-serving, but yeah.
Yeah, and I don't want to interrupt you for making your second point, but I actually don't know if it matters that much, right? Like,
right, I agree.
Do I care if the corporation's acting in the right way? Do I care if it's authentic in this way that it's actually hard to think about a corporation being authentic anyways? Because we think about them as people, but they're these structures, and I'm not sure that even makes sense to me in my head. But I think the one thing we can tell is what are the actions, right? And that's what you're talking about, Tank. How do I get money from you, right? How hard are you making it? That's how I can tell whether the corporation's really into it, right? Are they putting these millions of dollars behind layers and layers of red tape? How are they dispensing it? And I think some corporations I've seen have, they have these roles inside the company that are made to distribute the money. And I think the kind of person that you put in that role tells you a lot about how the corporation, how seriously they take that, right? Are you putting somebody in that role that cares about it and can find out the right issues and uses the force of the corporation for good? Or are they somebody that doesn't really believe in it and they can take this role, pocket the money of the salary, and hide it behind bureaucracy?
Yeah, no, I mean, I really appreciate the corporations who kind of have that open book policy that they say, like, here, we're not going to put this money in with all of our other money. We're going to set this money completely aside over here. And, the public can watch the money go and where it's used at. And I appreciate that method. It's that method of, we had a problem with the NFL where they said that they were going to contribute $250 million. And then we had a player say, hey, I'm in New Orleans. These kids they don't have laptops. They don't have equipment. How do I get access to that money? And it was just so much runaround, we're on the inside of the NFL, right? So it's that little problem that we're facing.
There are many ways to get involved with the Prison Cells podcast, build your moral courage, and help us eradicate for-profit prisons in the U.S. Visit abolishprivateprisons.org today and build the momentum of abolishing private prisons by working with an organization to pass a resolution in support of the cause. Get to know the ins and outs of how private prisons operate and why. Outside of the site, you can write your congressperson and shed light on this awful practice. As always, please like, share, and subscribe to the Prison Cells podcast from wherever you listen. Now back to the discussion.
Just to take a thread there and get back to the point, Colin Kaepernick still doesn't play. And if you talk, Tank, about the owners and you talk about the fact that, in the shadow of the George Floyd protests, the NFL decides to come out and Roger Goodell says we were wrong about Colin Kaepernick, he's still not playing. And the thing that I find really interesting is that most of the owners in the NFL aren't interested in having that type of controversy. I mean, you think about all of the quarterbacks that go down, Colin Kaepernick has to be at least as talented as half of the backups that are playing in the NFL today. And yet we still have an issue with the fact that you're talking about being a part of a wave, seeing which way the wind's blowing and then jumping in that direction. And you have to imagine that the NFL is just as guilty as the corporations are in connection with the fact that, Colin Kaepernick's still not playing, and yet they want to admit that they were wrong about it. They want to be seen as supporting $250 million to social justice issues, and then you take a full day with John Dacey to get a $5,000 grant, when in fact there's $250 million that's supposed to be available for things like laptops in underprivileged kids' classrooms,
Right.
supporting abolished prisons. And so I think that there's some reality to this fact that PR and corporate sort of desire to be seen as on the right side of history motivates so much of this.
Right.
When you have to ask, do the board members, do the owners really care?
Right. And I just want to make the distinction that this is not a, bash the NFL thing by no means. It's an example of the corporation and the dollars and the pathway into getting it. And it's just an example of kind of what we're talking about in terms of like, putting your money where your mouth is and having access to that money be readily available.
Yeah. I will, and I'll just make a really quick comment there, Tank, which is, I don't think if Walmart's putting $1 million into court observation project and the NFL is putting $250 million into social justice issues, I don't really care what the motivation is. If we're going to get that money into the hands of people that can make systemic change, then let's make that happen. I agree with you, though. It should be much easier to access those funds. To my second point, Robbie, earlier, and to your question about, does the audience matter? So for these corporations that are coming out with these woke statements, that these corporations that are putting money into supporting the end of systemic discrimination, that may very well be a nod to the up and coming generation of consumers. Those of us that really care about social justice, that don't really want to be a part of a country that's hateful towards homosexual folks, that are that discriminates against race. When the audience are governments, right, where the Corrections Corporation of America or CoreCivic now, where Geo Group, management training, where those audiences are governments, I do think it changes the incentives. I think that the sense that these private profit centers care about is whether or not these governments are interested in locking up human beings. And right now, one of the things that I've talked about a lot in my research and writing is that the war on drugs was a real profit center for a long time, right? That's where these private prisons were able to get a lot of consumers. And by that, I mean that not consumers, but their commodity were human beings that were either selling or smoking marijuana, or that were pushing or selling drugs in particular. And as we've sort of become enlightened about the war on drugs, as we see what a failure it's been and how it's been so systemically discriminatory against Black and brown people, now the client, the government, is horning in on immigration. That's the thing, the thing that no longer, I think, can the government and private prisons focus on low-level drugs as jailable offenses. Now they're saying if you're in the country illegally, that's going to be the jailable offense. And ultimately, what's perverse about all of this is that because the private prison's motivation is money, once we get immigration right, if we ever do, they're just going to slide to the next sort of governmental focus on who they want locked up. And so I think it does change motivations when the customer or the consumer is the government, because private prisons aren't really responding to those of us with our shopping dollars that would just say boycott. We're not going to, because as I've written, private prisons provide no justifiable positive. That Nike makes shoes that we wear. McDonald's, makes food that people eat. Private prisons provide nothing other than warehousing that government entities should be providing that service anyway.
I wonder if now's a good time to talk about how they actually make money, right? Like, what does the contracting process look like? What do the resulting contracts look like? If I'm a corporation and I'm going to respond to one of these proposals from a government, what am I looking to get out of it? And how does that affect people?
Yeah. So private prisons, in my saying, provide no valuable service. The government historically has been in charge of um, of crime and punishment, who we lock up, where we lock them up, and it's taxpayer dollars that pay for that
So
provide
is
it.
rehabilitation not a service?
Well, so that's a very good question, Tank. So do our prisons rehabilitate? And that's the
No.
question.
But is that
Rehabilitation is supposed to be a service.
or service, resource, whatever. But I'm just wondering, like, could we give them a little, like, if that's like their business model, right? No,
That's what they claim. Right. So what they claim is that they claim that because they're private, they can be more efficient, they can provide better services. All evidence that I've seen rejects that that's what's happening.
Sure.
There's a terrific book called American Prisons by Shane Bauer. He was a undercover prison guard at a geo group, I believe, owned prison somewhere in Louisiana, I believe. And he talked about just how deeply perverse the profit incentive bastardizes rehabilitation. And ultimately, it isn't really about caretaking prisoners carefully and rehabilitating them. Ultimately, it's about what pennies, dollars can we squeeze out of every opportunity that comes to locking up human beings.
Right. And we were just talking about, let's look to see what businesses do to figure out what they're thinking, right? All we can do is, how are you doing things? There is another model for private prisons, right? In Australia and New Zealand, they have contracts that specify that they get paid not necessarily by a compensated man day as they are here. They get paid by their recidivism rate and how good the rehabilitation is, right? And I don't want to say that those are good models, because I think there are still deep concerns about tying up profit with incarceration and criminal justice. But I do think, in terms of, are you actually doing what you say you're going to doing business? Like, are you living up to what you're saying? Well, we know that these very same companies have a different business model that they could be using,
Right.
and they're not, right? And the business model that they're implementing in the United States is, I'm going to charge you for a compensated man day and not care about anything else, right? So, that's, they can put out their PR machine that says one thing. Let's see to what they're actually doing.
100% agree. It's one of those things where I always say, like, the corporation makes a product and it's up to the consumer how they use it, right? But in jail they don't really have that option, right? And so it's really controlled by the corporation, and they dictate how the ball is bounced, and if the reasoning behind the way they dictate everything is about money versus rehabilitation, then we're starting out in an uphill battle, that we're starting out kind of on the wrong end of it.
Corporate Law 101. Shareholders own a corporation, right? So once a corporation is formed, they offer shares to the investing public, and it's the shareholders that are the owners. The shareholders then elect the board of directors. They vote and decide who's going to run the corporation as far as a board of directors is concerned. And the board of directors hires the CEO, the CFO, the day-to-day executives that run a corporation. So the board of directors is sort of like they're the guide. They're the ones that put the goals together. They're the ones that think about, what do we want our growth goals to be? How do we want the corporation to run? They expect the day-to-day executives, the CEO, and those day-to-day executives to implement their mission. But ultimately, it's the shareholders that own a company. Okay. And so if you slide a private prison corporation into that model, the shareholders that own shares in a company like CoreCivic or a company like Geo Group, their expectation is that the board of directors they elect are going to run the corporation in a way that makes them very profitable. And so the idea that shareholders have in mind is that this board of directors is going to return a sizable profit to me on the way that they run this private corporation. And so then the CEOs that are hired are to execute this vision. And so the thing that I have, the thing that we started with at the top of the podcast today was this idea that corporations that are in for-profit prison scenarios have perverse incentives. And so what I wanted to think about for a second here was that if you're a board member of any corporation, what is your goal? Well, as a board member, you want your shareholders to be happy. They're the ones that elected you. And how are you going to have happy shareholders? You're going to have happy shareholders if you're returning a sizable profit for them. And if you want to start talking about perverse incentives, I like to imagine, what would a board meeting be like for a private prison company? And, corporate law 101 tells us that boards meet together to set goals for the corporation. They meet either quarterly, some meet monthly. But at this board meeting, the idea is for the board to talk about how are we going to increase growth? How are we going to increase profit? How are we going to make our shareholders happy? What are we going to do? And so one of the things that I think is a really important question to ask is, what do those board meetings look like for private prisons? When a board sits together and they on their agenda get to growth, what does that piece of the conversation look like? Now, we may spend some time shortly sort of role playing that out and looking at how that motivates. But one of the things that I think is really important is, how do these private prison corporations make money? They make money through contracting with municipalities and governments, where we transfer taxpayer dollars from a municipality into a private corporation, just like a hotel, just like a per diem, per bed rate, where cities and municipalities contractually pay a private prison corporation a certain amount of money to warehouse criminals. Rather than the government doing it themselves and using taxpayer dollars to pay for it, they contractually pay a private company to warehouse human beings. And many of the contracts in the United States, unlike in New Zealand that Robbie just referred to, they have no incentives to ensure that recidivism goes down or rehabilitation occurs. They just pay a per diem rate contractually to the private prison company, effectually transferring taxpayer dollars into the pockets of shareholders that own these private prison corporations, with literally no requirements contractually, at least in the contracts that I've seen and looked at, that those private prison inhabitants, the prisoners, are rehabilitated in any particular way. Their recidivism rates aren't tied into the contracts, at least not here in the United States. And so then you have a private prison corporation that's incentivized to do certain things. One, lock up as many people as possible, because that way they get more per diem payments per bed. They're incentivized to cut costs by paying prison guards less money. They're incentivized to cut costs as far as any prisoner programs are concerned, any educational programs, any athletic programs. They're incentivized to not just lock up as many people as possible, but they're incentivized to increase the number of days that those prisoners spend in the beds, where they can get more per diem.
Lock them up and keep them there. Yeah.
Lock them up and keep them there. Don't release them. And so the ways they make money, Robbie, to get to your question directly, is they make money contractually, where governments and municipalities pay them to warehouse human beings for longer periods of time, that they're incentivized to do that, to cut costs, meaning training, payment to prison guards, and to ensure that they have as many opportunities to make money as they can.
Yeah. After having talked about private prisons for several years at this point, we tell people that this is how the structure is set up. And one of the common refrains we hear is, well, maybe the government should do a better job writing the contracts, or maybe there should be more oversight. And obviously that's true, right? Like, the government should have better contracts. They should have more oversight. They should include more things in the contracts in terms of what programs do you have to include. do you have any targets or something like that? But I think one of the fundamental issues that isn't solved by that is the incentives are still the same, right? Like you can put whatever oversight you want on that person, you can put whatever requirements you want on that corporation, but the incentive, because they're a publicly traded corporation, is always going to be squeeze as much profit out of that as possible, right? And so it's true that they could be structured better, and it's true that there could be more requirements, but that fundamental incentive doesn't change to make more money, right? And I think the Shane Bauer book that you mentioned, American Prison, he talks about some of the actual effects, right? Like what kinds of things have you seen and did Shane Bauer see? How did that result? When a corporation is trying to squeeze the last dollar out of everybody that's inside, what happens to them?
One of the things that I think is really important to look at, Robbie, is the fact that prisoner rehabilitation programs cost money. If you want prisoners to get an education in prison, that costs money. If you want prisoners to work out or to be able to engage in physical fitness in prison, that costs money. If you want prisoners to eat healthy, or if they're religious and they want to eat, only certain types of foods, that costs money. If you want to have them guarded well, if you want to have them receive health care, if you want to have them receive psychological counseling, all of that costs money. The incentive is to cut it all. The incentive is to cut any educational programming, cut libraries out, ensure that health care is provided at the least cost possible, provide no psychological counseling. And that is exactly what's happening. Shane Bauer's book indicates, and my research indicates, that they are not providing proper health care to private prisoners. They are not providing psychological counseling to private prisoners. They are not providing rehabilitation efforts. They are not providing fresh foods to prisoners. And in fact, prisoners are treated horribly in the United States writ large, public prisons, private prisons, but they're treated worse in private prisons because the profit incentive dictates if you complain about a healthcare issue, we don't care about that. You are not going to see a doctor. If you have serious mental health problems, you are not talking to a counselor because it all costs money. And so from a very, very human place, we are treating prisoners as if they are subhuman. We do it in all prisons, but private prisons do it for profit and they do it worse. And all of the examples that I just indicated to you are true. Lawsuits abound against private prisons because of all of the ways that the prisoners are mistreated for profit. We haven't even talked about prison guards yet. Who are we hiring? How are we training them? Prison guards make minimum wage. They are trained abysmally. And in all of these circumstances, they are working extraordinarily long shifts. There should be many more guards in the private prisons, and there aren't. This is all indicated in the American Prison Shane Bauer book and the anecdotal research that I've conducted. And so what you have is a toxic cesspool of profit incentivized maltreatment of prisoners that are locked up. And don't even get me started on whether or not these individuals should even be locked up in the first place. So whenever I go on a rant like I'm currently on, and people say, well, they shouldn't be in prison. They're locked up. They did something wrong. They shouldn't be there. And my retort is always, who decides who gets locked up and what they're being locked up for? Did we lock up a single person for the financial market crisis of 2008? We did not. Everybody that engaged in securities fraud, wire fraud, and bank fraud in the financial mortgage meltdown, no one saw time. Who are we locking up? We're locking up people that are here illegally. We're locking up people that have sold or imbibed in marijuana or other drugs. And so the question is, these prisoners, where we lock up more than any other country in the world, we're mistreating them. And in my view, they shouldn't even be locked up, because they're being locked up for reasons that I think are indefensible.
But my I guess question would be, who is responsible for the checks and balances on that, right? So if you've got a government prison, right, then the government's in charge of it. And if you've got a private prison, then who's in charge of holding them accountable for the rights of these human beings that are in there. And I think, that may be, even better starting point is to that there should be either, if not similar rules, or the same rules for both prisons, right?
Well, if you're a corporation in another marketplace, the question then becomes, how do you keep the customer satisfied? Just another angle on what Tank just said. So based on what you've described, Dre, you would think that the government customer wouldn't want this service. If they're dismally failing, why would the government want this service? So how do private prison corporations gain favor with the agencies that pay them hundreds of millions of dollars to provide a service that you're describing as way below standard?
A failing service. Thank you for your comments, Tank. And I would just say no one's regulating private prisons, right? That's the government should be going in and ensuring that these contracts are being upheld.
Right.
They are not. And to John's point about how, if this is a failing service, how do they continue to exist? And they continue to exist because they have a powerful lobby. There are millions of dollars being spent by private prisons to ensure that the right people get elected, i.e., electioneering and Citizens United. They're making sure the right laws are getting passed through ALEC, a legislative drafting service. And they are the lobbying and the money from private prisons is flowing into the pockets of individuals. Prisoners be damned,
Right.
while pockets are being lined through lobbying, which I always mention to my students is illegal in many countries, not in the United States, through incentivizing the wrong kind of legislation, 3 strikes and you're out, SB 1070, all inspired by private prison forces. And then you have legislators that, in my view, are sort of soulless as far as humanity is concerned, that are pushing the perpetuation of for-profit incarceration.
I always ask the question, right? Like, so we've got government prisons and then we've got private prisons. Like, what's the thing that stops someone from making a prison that is a completely different business model, right? So you've got government and private. I mean, can't we just keep going and start to create some better types of facilities for people? This is America. It can be done.
501c3 that does prison humanely.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So I am not a prison abolitionist. I have some friends that are.
Right.
I want Jeffrey Dahmer and Charles Manson locked up, right? So, but my prison would house 10 people, not 1 million people, because there are only so many Jeffrey Dahmers and Charles Mansons that exist out there. We should lock up far fewer people, Tank, and maybe abolish private prisons, can start thinking about imprisoning humanely. And there are models for that, Tank, in Norway and in Holland. You have prisons that are built humanely, that exist for rehabilitation, that don't dehumanize. And in fact, the loss of liberty is enough of a punishment. You don't need to be brutalized like you are in the United States as well.
And I think when you look into the history of prisons in the United States, it's traced directly to slavery. So of course, that's how they're going to look, right? Like when you think about how slaves were treated, inhumanely, like mind-bogglingly violent lives. So those kinds of things are inherently going to translate into the prison system when that's where it came from. And I think, when you were talking about, is there a different way to do it? And it loops back into the question that I had about the beginning. Like, does it look different when the government is the consumer rather than the consumer is the consumer, right? And I think when you talk about the fact that they can take the money that they're making from the taxpayers and spend that money back into politicians, you get this feedback loop that's very different than how consumers, the feedback loop where the money enters it a different way. And it just came to me that model actually looks more like the old company town style, right? Where if you had a mine, you would have a company town, and you would pay your workers, but the workers would spend their money in the company town, and you could jack the prices up, and you could really take advantage of people in a different way. So it's not like the modern corporation where you have to convince people through advertising and all of those other ways to buy your product. You can actually create your own product and sell it using the money that you're taking from other people and keep that feedback loop making you richer.
It's immoral, Robbie, and it's incestuous. And I think your company town model is spot on, where the money is looped from politicians to prisons to back to politicians through ALEC, legislative drafting body that drafts these heinous laws to lock people up for longer periods of time. And it gets back into my perverse incentives conversation about what's really incentivizing the decisions that are being made by these corporate leaders.
You mentioned something earlier about mock shareholder meetings. And this is something that I think is really, really interesting. And I know that I think, sort of pioneered this model. John has done some really interesting work in this model. And I don't necessarily think we have to role play it, but I think, can you explain what you do with a mock shareholder meeting and who takes part in these things? Have you learned anything interesting from them? Like, what are people's reaction to that model? Just explain what a mock shareholder meeting is.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie. So you're calling it a mock shareholder meeting, and I'm going to call it a mock board meeting. Corporate law, 101B. Every year, corporations have to hold a shareholder meeting annually. And so this is where all the shareholders gather together. They elect board members. They vote on shareholder proposals. This provides an opportunity occasionally for shareholders to get up and speak to the group. I would like to think more about what a board meeting looks like. So one of the things that I've done in my work, and I know that John has done in some interesting circumstances as well, is I like to put people into the position of being a board member. So anyone listening today, I'd like you to think of yourself as a board member. And what that means typically is that you're probably a Harvard Business School graduate, or you're a successful business person and a corporation asks you to serve on their board. Well, you're going to say yes if it's a publicly traded company, because those board members get highly paid to be a board member and to lead a corporation. And you're going to be a business expert. You're going to be the leader of a corporation, and you know that who has elected you to serve on that board are shareholders. So you're beholden to them. You want your shareholders to be happy because they're the ones that have put you in place as this leader, as a board member. So I'd like everyone to think of themselves as being a board member of a private prison. So let's say you're a GEO Group board member. Now, if you guys go onto GEO Group's website, or you go onto CoreCivic's website, you're going to see that nearly all of the board members are middle-aged to elderly white males. So there's very few people of color that serve on the boards of these private prisons. And just to take a quick diversion, today, 2022, we still have a huge board diversity problem in the United States. Most board leadership of Fortune 500 companies, including these private prisons, are white males. Most of them are monolithic. Most of them have the same sort of business background. But we're a board member now in our sort of exercise. We're a board member of GEO Group. And we're holding our quarterly board meeting. So imagine you're a board member of the GEO Group. You're sitting in Aruba at a beautiful board, around a beautiful, cherry wood table, and you're following your agenda as this board member, remembering that you want to make your shareholders happy. And as you follow the agenda of the GEO Group, you get to growth. And what I have done in my classes and what I've done in various settings is I try to role play out what that board meeting might sound like when you get to growth. So I ask people, if you're a board member of a private prison company, what do you talk about? when you get to growth? How are you going to grow?
I go from 2-ply to 1-ply.
2-ply to 1-ply.
There you go.
If
Save us some bucks.
if toilet paper at all.
if at all.
Maybe just go into the shower stall.
That's it.
So I like to think about Disney. Disney's board, they're talking about their next film. They're talking about the next series they're going to stream. They're talking about the next theme park. Nike's board meeting. They're talking about whether or not they want to sign LeBron to another lifetime deal to endorse their shoes. They're talking about the new Vomeros that they're going to have in 2022. They're talking about, unfortunately, probably how they're going to manufacture more cheaply in China or what have you. But if you're a Geo Group board member, first thing, 1-ply. How are we going to cut costs? What else are you going to do? What else are you going to do as a Geo Group board member? How are you going to grow your product?
Make more things illegal.
Make more things illegal. How are you going to do that? Well, we got these legislators elected because we gave them campaign finances, and we're going to lobby them to make something that's never been illegal before illegal now. Really important to understand that immigration was never a jailable offense in the 1980s, 1990s. It became a jailable offense when we started dreaming up more things to lock people up for, incentivized by the private prison lobby. What else are we going to make illegal? We're making marijuana no longer illegal, so we need more stuff that we can lock people up for. What else?
Right. I mean, it just seems like you can go as complex or as simple. You can go as complex as changing laws, or as simple as adding another quarter in the vending machine. But whatever it is, you're making money. But I mean, definitely another one is just kind of what you charge for commissary. You can. The prison tax, right? The prison tax, there's no regulated number on like what the value of something in prison can be. So they can just go up and up, and it's like the price of diamonds, right? For a toothbrush, right? And so you see that every year. Phone calls, stamps. A stamp in the world, it's what the prisoners call it. They call it the world. A stamp in the world is 10 cents, 25 cents. A stamp in prison is $4. $4. And this is not from inmate to inmate. This is from inmate to institution. And so it's just that level of just kind of like hustling the inmate is it's terrible.
And who's paying for that, Tank? It's the families of the prisoners that are broke ass in the first place. Yeah. That we are literally breaking poor families by locking up their sons and daughters and putting this enormous tax on them for what?
Taking their last. They're in prison too.
Corporate profit. And we're not just talking private prisons here. Now we're talking vendors. Now we're talking whoever provides the phone services at $4.50 a minute for a local call. Now we're talking about...
Nothing is that important to talk about.
John, you've done this exercise with some interesting people. Can you explain what you've seen?
Sure. So I was invited by some professors at the University of Notre Dame to participate in their Moreau college initiative, which is offering 40 to 50 college credit courses in Westville Prison in Indiana every semester. And I was invited to come and speak, and to a group of about 35 men in that prison, I posed to them, let's pretend each one of you has a significant amount of stock in a private prison corporation. And this is our annual meeting, and guess what? The president just said we're going to do away with private prisons at the federal level. We got to strategically plan, how are we going to keep the business we have? And as you said, how are we going to grow our business? And so these 35 fellows were all pretty doggone savvy, and they come up with a bunch of ideas.
Wow.
So one of them is, your typical corporation, and maybe your number one product isn't selling so well anymore. What are you going to do? You're going to create more products. You're going to diversify what it is you do. And maybe you're going to take, your product to places where they're not buying your product yet. And so you have to come up with a story why they should do this. So if we go to
Propaganda.
remote areas in rural areas, what are we going to do? These are depressed places. Well, we're going to promise jobs. They may not be good jobs, but we're going to promise a lot of jobs. We got to diversify our product. If we're not going to incarcerate people in the state of Washington anymore because they just passed a law that prohibits private prisons and jails, what are we going to sell? Well, we can sell for-profit probation, parole, monitoring equipment, community corrections, go into bail bonds. What else can we do? And these fellas were pretty good about it. Well, you can come up with ways to hinder early release credits or clemency. And you can have a corporate culture with your workforce about when and how often you write incident reports on people that affects their freedom very directly.
These were answers directly from them?
Well, if you've got a bunch of disciplinary infractions, it might affect whether you're going to get early release or how the Board of Clemency views you.
All right.
But in terms of changing laws, the obvious things are criminalizing more things like you just mentioned, or, as the private prison industry has already done, affecting sentencing policies. But what would be much more subtle is a law that if the state ever has to look at building a new prison, it must first consider private prisons before it uses any more public prisons. Such a law exists in Arizona. So, you can also take your show on the road to places that have never even heard of private prisons.
The growth potential is astronomical. And I think our primary point today, at least mine, is private prisons shouldn't exist at all. Private prisons, the perverse incentives and the idea that you can make money off of incarcerating more people for longer is perverse, immoral, and we shouldn't abide it. Let me just finish this exercise, Robbie, about the board meeting. So once you get through all of the ways to cut costs, all of the ways to go one ply instead of two, all of the ways to reduce the amount of healthy food, all of the ways, we talked about it earlier, don't provide proper health care. If you're a private prison, I've heard John talk about this, the private prisons lobby to only accept the healthiest prisoners so that they don't have the opportunity, so that they don't have the cost of unhealthy prisoners. So it sounds like a slave auction to me, where you have human beings that are being bartered over which ones are we going to buy into our system. It sounds like commodifying human beings. The other thing that I just wanted to mention quickly is that when I've done this exercise, I do this corporate board exercise with my students, and I put my students into these board scenarios and we actually play it out. I have found that the students get really caught up in this game of being successful in maximizing profits to make their shareholders happy, that they kind of lose their minds. They lose their moral compasses, and they start saying things that they don't really believe. But because they get so caught up in maximizing profits, they get so caught up in the game.
I don't know, they don't believe it. They don't understand it, really.
They may not understand what they're doing,
right?
But at the same time,
about humans.
Yeah, they're saying things like, if we eliminate probation, then we can keep people locked up longer and make more money for our shareholders. And after they give their presentation, I'm like, did you just say eliminate probation and replace it with prison time? Probation is how you're supposed to be able to get out and prove that you're ready to rejoin society. And they say these really bananas things because they get so caught up in I'm a board member now. I have the power, and I'm incentivized to make money for my shareholders so that I can keep this powerful position. And it's been, even with students that I would say are woke, they oftentimes sort of lose their moral compass because they get caught up so much in this exercise of maximizing profits for shareholders that I don't know that there's a way, to your points earlier, there isn't really a way to do it right. The only real way that private prison problem is dealt with is by eliminating them, because regulating them better, or incentivizing them with rehabilitation or recidivism, you still have the problem of the perverse incentives that can't be solved, I think, through just making them more contractually beholden to principles.
Yeah. As we close out today, the way that you're talking about people changing their mindset when they play this role, I think that is intentional. We've talked about the language that gets used in these SEC filings before. For example, we talk about compensated man days. You do these things to not realize that you're talking about a human being, right? Because if you did truly understand it, most people, I don't think, have the capability to do these things to human people, right? So we have all these ways to sort of gloss over the fact that what we are dealing with fundamentally is people, right? And when we talk about people that are in prison, they're still people, right? And we're all in this society together. And these little linguistic ways that we use to forget that enables the corporations to do what they do. So, Dre, I know your time is very valuable. Thank you so much for joining us. John and Tank, as usual, it was my pleasure. And I hope everybody joins us next week.
Thank you.